Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be part 2 of my wrap-up of National Poetry Month. National Poetry Month is an event that happens in both Canada and the United States, and it basically just exists to encourage people to read poetry, and I like poetry, so I didn't need that much encouragement. I will link to my video from the first half of April below. This is the poetry that I read in the second half of April. So the first book of poetry that I read during the second half of the month was Admission Requirements by Phoebe Wang. This is a collection of mostly long-form free verse poetry, basically interrogating questions of family. I read this on my flight out to Calgary a couple of weeks ago, and I really enjoyed it while I was reading it, but it hasn't been the most memorable for me. So it's a bit of a neutral. I find that right now I have a hard time thinking of anything to talk about. And I think it explored a lot of interesting issues, but not in a way that I think was creative or distinct enough to really stay with you. But still, I appreciated it as I was reading it. I will read a bit of one for you. It's high time the Thames coughs up the missing links and the keys it seized. Only the most noteworthy finds are tagged and numbered in a British museum, or the British Museum, where admission is free. As long as you decamp with nothing, the law prevents you from restoring. These specimens are accommodated in climate-controlled conditions. Many-sided Roman dice and scattered chessmen whose berserk expressions have lost their original intention no longer tether fates to speculation. The game's already played. We're all winners of these ancestral treasures, poles crested with gazes I can put a name to, raven, beaver, and mother bear. But my connection isn't clear. In the shrouded houses they once guarded, assembled kin recount where they've been and what they've seen. Which again, as I'm reading it, I'm like, yeah, that has a good rhythm to it and an interesting subject. But before I went to read that out, I didn't really remember much that was in there, so I will read another one in case you are curious. It is one thing to speak your desires, another to name them. I too was bent on being elsewhere when bagging Florida mandarins with my mom on Somerset. I too have a name I never use. Ottawa, Ottawa, a place of trade. Bins of dried fish, flattened with fins curling up like parchment. Then the Yangtze restaurant where we'd order off the carts. Then a driver pulls beside me, mistaking my line of work, and I walked uneasily years afterwards. What good are maps if nothing's to scale? So both of those I thought had a solid rhythm to them and interesting subject matter, but if I'm being completely honest, since I read that a couple of weeks ago, I actually couldn't remember much about the collection as a whole, so I don't know how sticky most of it was, but if you enjoy poetry that touches on issues like that, I think it's definitely worth picking up. After that, I picked up Madhur and Anand's new index for predicting catastrophes. This was great fun. This is a collection of poetry in which most of the poems are inspired by specific journal articles in journals of ecology and biology and whatnot. So if you've never seen a poem with footnotes to scientific journals before, have I got a poetry collection for you. I was so impressed with this. I think if you're not particularly interested in matters of ecology and whatnot, it might not be as interesting, but I thought this was a combination of two things that are fantastic because I've genuinely never seen anything like this before. There's certainly a lot of poetry that talks about nature, but often with an artist's eye and not with a scientist's eye. And I thought it was brilliant that that's what this collection was doing. Let me show you see the footnotes there? We'll read this. Especially in a time. Wild populations recognize that the linearity, the relative rareness, the major museums, or any area which is known is a surrogate for proximity. Stream beetles, Galapagos finches, and Israeli passerine birds are transformed into an index of limited available information. Eltral lengths, slope of regression, and the mid-latitude precipitation unravel the anomalies. A prolonged change is also under scrutiny. And the footnote on this is to the article, Rapid Morphological Change in Stream Beetle Museum Specimens Correlates with Climate Change, from the Journal of Ecological Entomology. Here's another one. This is called The Gallery. Was abandoned 27 years ago. Undisturbed by power, pollution, or annual precipitation. It was based on ecological reasoning and sensitive to removal. The failure of seeds to arrive strengthened the canonical resident communities found it, building a path through the subtropical forest. They removed insignificant arrows, which made it less isolated. It provided relief among the small-scale agriculture and granite outcrops. They experienced an intense range shift in history, a five-fold decrease in what was appropriate, a heavier reliance on finding. And then this has the footnote of causal effects of latitude disturbance and dispersal limitation in richness in a recovering temperate, subtropical, and tropical forest from the Journal of Vegetation Science, 2012. And so on and so forth. I loved this. I thought this was great. I think rhythmically it is maybe not as interesting as some poetry that it has a more pure, if you will, artistic focus, but I thought it was brilliant to see something that went in the direction that that went. And I've never seen anything quite like that, and I thought it was fantastic. And finally, I read Safia Elhillo's The January Children. This is a book of poems, most of which are basically the author interrogating a 50s, 60s Egyptian pop singer on issues of culture and belonging, more or less. And it was just fantastic. If you follow Elaine from Books by Lanes, she went to a poetry reading that this author did in Berlin, and I will link to that below because she reads one or two of her own poems in that video, and I think it's worth checking out. The title reference is to the fact that during the British colonial period in Sudan, people were given basically random birth years and all assigned January birthdays. So she's talking about the generation of the grandfathers that all were born, quote unquote, in January. This is just great stuff. I think it's easy to be cynical about something that connects so clearly to pop culture as this does, even though it's, 50s, 60s pop culture. But I thought this was just spectacularly well done, and I think spoke to a lot of the conflict of migrations in steps in kind of the Sudan to Egypt to the United States and then back and forth, and language fluency and whose language do you speak, because one of the bits that's being interrogated is that North Sudanese people are, might have a self-identity as Arabs, whereas most Arabs would consider them to be Arabized Africans as opposed to that. So one of the poems is getting into what is a native language and what does that mean? And then the romance, because it's being addressed to this singer. It's great. The lyrics do not translate. Arabic is all verbs for what stays still in other languages. I love that line. Anyway, as I said, I'm not going to read any of this poetry because you can check the link and listen to the author reading her own poetry. But yeah, I thought this was great. It made me so much less cynical than I normally am about poetry that references other art forms so explicitly as this did, because this was just so successfully done. It's great. There's still a couple of days left of April as I'm filming this, so I may actually pick up another collection of poetry or two, so they may appear in a random wrap-up sometime in the future. But as it stands now, this was the end of National Poetry Month. I think I normally pick up poetry in between other things, so reading several collections of poetry and being able to compare and contrast the styles and whatnot was a lot of fun. So if you were reading poetry this month, and I know several of you were because we talked about it a bit in the last video, I'd love to hear more about what you're reading, if you've read more things in the second half of the month. And if you've read any of these, I'd love to know what you thought of them. That's it for now. Ciao.